don't know that I'll ever write about him as a teenager or even anything before when he became a law professor, simply because I have a strong affinity for Boady, the teenager, and I don't see that character as being more than what I made him in Nothing More Dangerous. That may change in time, but right now I think that when I go back to Boady, it'll be him as an adult.
On your website, you include a teacher's guide for Nothing More Dangerous, whereas there wasn't such a thing for your other books. Was it always your intention that this book be used as an educational tool, and have many schools participated?
Some schools have participated. I don't know how many. We were getting requests for it in the spring before COVID hit, and then after that, I don't know. I've lost track of that, so I know there are some schools that are teaching it. The teaching guide came about, I think, more because of the era that we're in. When Barack Obama became president, I really kind of thought that there was a chance that this novel may never see the light of day. But then things changed. One of the messages of the novel is that racism and prejudice isn't something that's changed by edict. You can't tell somebody to stop thinking the way they think. It's something that has to change from the inside. That's why the title of the novel, Nothing More Dangerous, comes from a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. There's nothing in all the world more dangerous than sincere ignorance. And so the message of the novel is about that has to come from inside. And if you're not willing to look at it in yourself, you're not going to change. And so when the us and them aspect of our country became much more stark, and the white supremacists were coming out of the woodwork, I thought this is kind of what the whole book is about, is that this stuff exists. People, they will hide, but that spark will still be there waiting for oxygen to release it and give it energy. And that's when I decided that I wanted to try and get this into schools, because Kill a Mockingbird is one of my favorite all-time novels. But I was able to grow up in an era where I was racist, thinking, however, that I was not racist. I was not prejudiced because I did not believe in that kind of racism that existed in To Kill a Mockingbird, that overt Jim Crow era, different drinking fountains, sit in the back of the bus kind of racism. I thought if I didn't subscribe to that level of difference, then I wasn't prejudiced. And that simply is not the case. Nothing More Dangerous goes into the more subtle subconscious beliefs that create the us and them. And there's a great, I want to say great line because I wrote it, but there's a line in the novel where Hoke is talking to Boady about this issue. And he says that prejudices are something that come from our ancestors who were just trying to figure out what's good and what's bad. What do they hunt? What do they fear? They prejudge things. And so we all have that instinct to prejudge. We all have the instinct for prejudice. He says it's not a matter of if we have prejudices. We do. It's a matter of understanding those instincts and fighting against them. That message, I think, was the one that I wanted this book to carry, especially to a younger generation. That it's just not simply a matter of, do I think that blacks and whites should drink out of different drinking fountains? It's more subtle than that.
Very well said.
Yes.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. Growing up, you think you have an open mind. It's society and it's where you grew up, especially how people looked at racism. And I went to a high school that there was only a few black people. It's there. It was part of our lives. But as an adult, you definitely try to overcome it, or at least I did, and try to judge people by them.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of people in public and in private lives who would swear they are not racist, but boy, they show some racist tendencies.
There's a line where Boady, earlier on in the novel, is talking to Hoke, and he says, I'm not prejudiced. I think that blacks can be just as good as whites if they try hard enough. And so Boady truly believes he's not prejudiced. He really does have a good heart. He believes this, but yet he uses terms, the N-word terms, freely because that's, in his mind, that's just an expression. And so at one point, Hoke has to explain to him the history of that word and why just using that word alone by a white person carries weight. It means something more than just the word itself. And so there's a lot of lessons for Boady to learn. And I want to also stress that this is a book about a young man coming to understand that aspect of himself, but there's also a mystery. Hoke has this entire journey, that story of redemption. It's a story of friendship and love and community, and I'm really proud of this book because there's just a lot to it, I think.
Absolutely, and I have to say Hoke was my favorite in the book.
You could write a whole new book about Hoke and his story.
Yeah, that was very powerful.
I have been given that suggestion, but at this point I don't know, because of the powerful ending to hoax story in Nothing More Dangerous. I don't know if going back and telling an earlier version of that would have the same impact, but there are people who would like me to do that.
Alan, can you share your website with our listeners so they can find out more about you and your books?
It is alaneskens.com, ALLENESKENS.com. I have book club questions for all my books on there. I don't know if the teacher's guide is on there or not.
It was on your website. That's where I found it.
Oh, good.
Are you working on any new projects you'd like our listeners to know about?
I'm always working on projects. I have the luxury of being a huge daydreamer. I have more ideas, more novels, more stories in my head than I have time to write. But right now I'm finishing up book number 7, which is Lila Nash's story. So in The Life We Bury, and the sequel to that is The Shadows We Hide. Those 2 books are about Joe Talbot. In The Life We Bury, he meets this young woman named Lila Nash, and they become a couple. She has a backstory that is talked about in both those 2 novels. Her story, which comes out next fall, 2021, is called The Stolen Hours. It is her coming face to face with her dark past and having to face some things that happened to her when she was younger. It's my first female protagonist. I am very pleased with how it turned out. I have a female agent, female editor, and a female wife who I've relied upon heavily to guide me. And for the past couple of years, I've been reading nothing but female authors and female protagonists to try and learn lessons from them on how to write a well-rounded female character.
I remember her story, and I can't wait to read that.
Just out of curiosity, I have this thought in the back of my head that a lot of authors will include the pandemic in some way in their novels going forward. Has that occurred to you?
It hasn't, actually. My hope is that there will be a vaccine by the end of the year, and that by the time the book comes out, enough people will be vaccinated that we will be back to some semblance of normalcy. I look forward to doing a in-person book event in the fall when the book launches. This fall is the first year that I haven't had a book out since 2014. If you're going to have a year without a book, this would be the one, because you can't do in-person events, and I would miss that. I like that in-person contact.
Well, Alan, we thank you so much for joining us today. We loved this book. It was such a powerful message. I think everybody should read this book. It's really a wonderful story.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate your inviting me to be here and talk about it.
Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We read many books for this podcast. You hear us say quite often that we highly recommend these books to you. This is one book. If you do not take any of our recommendations, please take this one. It hits you on so many different levels. It's a good mystery, but the emotions that you will feel by reading this book, it almost makes me speechless. But that's not what we're here to do.
The story of Boady is basically a coming-of-age story. It's a meet a new friend and have an adventure story.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in my notes, I have written down that this book really makes me think of Stephen King's The Body, which was later made into the movie Stand By Me. I got that vibe through the book, which is a great honor to be lumped in with that.
That was a good analogy. I was thinking almost like a Huckleberry Finn. I mean, in the fact that they went camping, they're out in the woods, they're looking for answers, they're looking for a body.
Well, they weren't looking for the body. They just happened
to find it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this was multi-layered. There were so many social issues that were addressed besides the race issue. There's a story involving a homosexual man.
There's a lot of different trails in this story, and one trail is the story of a gay man. One is the story of the black family. One
alcoholism.
Bigotry.
But when we say this book isn't preachy in any way, shape, or form. It's a wonderful story. I don't think Alan set out to make a book that was trying to teach you a lesson. It just happens to.
He wrote the book so well that it took me back to my childhood in 1976. And it made me think about the way that people acted towards other people, especially Black people. I don't think that there was a segregated area purposefully, but I think Black people lived in their communities and white people lived in our communities. And because of that, there was underlying prejudice. We didn't have interaction. As Alan said, we do have those prejudices without even realizing it sometimes. And then when it's pointed out, like in this book, you go back and say, yeah, I remember thinking or saying certain things.
Well, I do have a story from my youth that definitely addresses this. The high school I went to had very few minorities of any kind, and around 1977, 1978, the county I lived in was starting to bus students into areas to try to make them more a microcosm of different neighborhoods. The next town over, there were a lot more Black people in that neighborhood, so they started busing them into our high school. We had a race riot at my high school where we had to be evacuated from the school, and they brought in helicopters, and it was very terrifying. But I remember at the time, I was very young. I went to a senior high school. I remember really at the time thinking how terrifying for them. They're walking into a school where they are not wanted and they don't want to be there. That was a very eye-opening experience. And that's really the first time in my life that I experienced racism. It really opened my eyes, and I am sorry that I went through it, but I'm glad that it opened some people's eyes and it probably closed some other people's eyes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was raised in the 50s because I'm a lot older than you kiddos. I can remember when we got our first Black teacher in the school, and my mother was one of the first people to go up and shake that person's hand.
I can believe that of my grandmother.
My mother would not allow us to be prejudiced against anybody. We were told you are no better than anybody and you're no worse than anybody. You are you, and live your life the way you want other people to see you. I was blessed in that way. But the area I grew up in, the N-word was used as a phrase.
Yeah, it was a descriptor.
We did not think anything of using that term. It was not derogatory.
Well, I remember Brazil nuts. I am mortified that I used that as a child.
We used that for years. Would not say anything to anyone that would make them feel less of a human. And now I realize how horrible that was of me. It's a shock almost. How would I ever think that was the right thing to do?
This book, to me, had everything. It had characters that will stick with you, a storyline that invokes every emotion you ever thought you could have. And I really like the fact that it took place in the 70s before what we thought was things getting better. But now that we're almost reliving some of these things that we thought should go away, I think it was very appropriate that this will come out now, even though he didn't plan it that way.
But there are pockets in this country where this book would be, it's nothing. How dare they say these people are prejudiced?
That's why I think it was appropriate that the book in the 70s, nobody will say that there was no prejudice back there.
They can't.
Even if you are prejudiced, you're going to admit, yes, that was a very prejudiced time.
But it was on the upswing of what we thought life was getting better. People were becoming more enlightened about that. Of course, the 50s and the 60s were much, much worse and overt in the racism, where these people in this KKK-like community, Jarvis Halcomb and his kin belonged to, they were called the Corps. They still had to operate clandestinely. They couldn't be overt. So you think that at that time, things were getting better. It wasn't socially okay to be an outright racist. And yet now, here we are again with people who are very comfortable being racist.
But everybody knew who was in the Corps, but they didn't advertise it. They wore masks, but everybody knew who they were. Milo and his friends, They knew exactly who it was.
But that's why I thought that this was such a brilliant idea to have this story told through